I said, our speaker today, Colonel Robert Lilac, career Air Force. He's got over 4,000 flight hours. And how long have you been with us here at the Air Museum, Bob? You got 4,000 museum hours
13. Yet? Probably about that.
Flying various aircraft, what, T-33, T-37, 38, F-100, F-104. I'm assuming you're going to share a little 104 history with us today, Bob. And of course, our featured aircraft today, the A-7D. He flew combat missions over Vietnam and was a recipient of the Legion of Merit, Defense Superior Service Medal, Air Medal 8 times over, and Distinguished Flying Cross. He volunteers here at the museum, as I said, and you can catch him teaching here in the hangar, and of course, various days with little people getting off big yellow buses. Won't you please welcome our instructor today, Colonel Robert Lilac.
Thanks, Greg. Am I on the air? Can you guys hear me okay? I'm wired up by Greg, so I'm not really sure how it's going to work. I want to thank you all for showing up. I guess, like myself and my wife, none of us could afford tickets to Coachella, so that's why we're here. But anyway, thanks again for being here. I'd like to tell you a little bit about flight test in general, and then more specifically, some of the testing I did on the A-7D. This is an A-7A, earlier version, Navy version of the airplane. Later, that was sort of a very basic airplane, did a great job for the Navy, kind of replacing the A-4. And then later on, the Air Force was convinced by Congress to adopt the airplane, and they decided to adopt it, but they wanted a lot of bells and whistles on the airplane. So the A-7D came from sort of, this was a great vehicle like a Volkswagen Beetle. The A-7D is more like a BMW. It had a lot of stuff on it. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. I don't know how to tell my background. Greg touched on it really well, but Abraham Lincoln was one of my favorite presidents, and I was trying to say, how are you going to, Bob, tell your story about how you got to come and test the A-7D? So it kind of goes like this, if you bear with me. 86 years ago, my father brought forth on this continent a new son, conceived in Stillwater, New York, aided and abetted by my mom, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, even if they're a little short. This short little ugly fella came to test the A-7D SLUF. In the early days, Orville and Wilbur kind of did it themselves. Early testing, designers had to test airplanes, design them, try to fly them, test them, fail, go ahead and test again. In the early days, training was pretty basic, on-the-job training, and then it became more formal. Eventually, formal training ended up for the Air Force up here at Edwards Air Force Base, where I went through test pilot school. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But Edwards was considered sort of the MIT of aerospace training. What is it really, a test pilot? Quick definition, test pilot. A person who does precision guesswork based on unreliable data provided by those of questionable knowledge. There are all kinds of test pilots. Experimental test pilots, the company test pilots, the guy that flew the airplanes first after they were designed and built. Production test pilots, the guy that tested the airplanes coming off the production lines. FCF pilots, maintenance test pilots, guys that tested airplanes after major maintenance on airplanes. Operational test pilots, the guys out in the fleet or in the squadrons that wanted to see if we test pilots knew what we were talking about, so they took it through the ringer on their own terms. That was operational testing. And research test pilots, the guy that flew the X airplanes. This X, by the way, is a symbol of the Society of Experimental Test Pilots. Any SETP graduates or alumni here? Okay, thanks God, and you don't have anybody fact-checking me too much. I've been a member of the Society of Experimental Test Pilots for over 50 years. Long time. History. In December 1903, we all know about the Wright brothers had their first flight at Kitty Hawk. First, as our people here at the classrooms tell our youth the first controlled flight was done by the Wright brothers on the 17th of December, 1903. But the Wright brothers went on the basics of people before them. There was a gentleman in UK by the name of Sir William Cayley who came up with a lot of the math of flying. He kind of coined the terms thrust, drag, lift. We all sit here, gravity holding us to the seats, and we use lift to overcome it. So the 4 forces of flight. We give all the kids that come here to the museum little bracelets, and on the bracelets, it has those 4 forces of flight. They're pretty important. Thrust overcomes gravity, and lift overcomes drag. The other way around, right? Mary Ann, did I get it right? No, I didn't. Okay. Yeah. Thrust overcomes drag, and lift overcomes gravity. Gravity is holding us to the ground. The Wright brothers, most people know that story. Bike builders in Dayton, Ohio, and they had to do everything themselves. They started out with gliders and eventually came to that very famous first controlled flight of 100 and about 90 feet at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. But remember, engineers are not always right. These are some of the kind of vehicles that they tried to design. Multi-wings, gliders, all sorts of crazy things. Right side up and upside down. Designers, geniuses supposedly, ingenious designs, but not so genius sometimes. But people like Octave Chanute, who was a very early worker of gliders, helped the Wright brothers develop their techniques for gliders that eventually came to powered flight in 1903. I can't remember how to pronounce these French guys' names, but you remember hot air balloons in the 1780s. Mary Ann, help me, Montgolfier brothers, something like that. A couple of brothers tried to fly hot air balloons. They were testing them, but they didn't go the way they wanted them to. They went the way the wind blew them. So they had to come up with some other kind of controlled flights. Guys tried to copy the birds with things like the ornithopter. That little thing that looks like a bird. I think when they jumped off, the wings collapsed and it fell on the ground, and they wound up getting. You've probably seen some of this stuff on YouTube. There was a Smithsonian, the Secretary of Smithsonian in 1903, about the same time as the Wright brothers. Samuel Pierpont Langley tried to be the first guy to have controlled flight, and he tried to fly off a boat in the Potomac. The thing got airborne a little bit, jumped off, fell into the Potomac, and then the Wright brothers, a couple of weeks later, beat him to that first controlled flight. So there's a lot of failures in testing, all sorts of different kind of things. Later on, different people tried to design other kinds of airplanes. This one is called the Salmon. It was a Navy design built by Lockheed. Salmon was named after Fish Salmon, who was a test pilot who tried to fly it. He never got it airborne vertically. He got it airborne with horizontal takeoffs and was able to hover vertically, but never take off vertically. And then, of course, guys like Craig Hoskins, who came up with this airplane, he said, I'm an acro guy, so I'll do it upside down and right side up. That was another version of a test pilot. But really, what are test pilots? The test pilot has to juggle a lot of things. We had the engineers designing it, the marketeers trying to sell it. The users always wanted more. We always had budget problems, all sorts of problems. But the test pilot mission was basically to juggle, as a balancing act, to juggle all these things and the development of an airplane. And in a lot of cases, he was not really appreciated because he told it like it was. Test pilot's job, observe, record, report. Basically, test piloting is precision flying. Honesty, telling it like it is. Again, not always appreciated by those people that were trying to do the other things that I mentioned. Test pilots. Humble, sometimes not always humble. It helped to have a pretty big ego because you had to stand up to some of the designers that were trying to tell you that the airplane could do things that it really couldn't do. So there's a story about how can you tell when a test pilot walks into a room. Well, just hang around a couple of minutes and he'll tell you. And test pilots had to sometimes come up with some innovative approaches to flying. If the system didn't work as designed, a test pilot had flexibility, and sometimes it was required. I never tried this, but I know the guy that hung from that pylon just as a joke one time. Early test flying started, actually, the Wright brothers flew out of Fort McNair near Washington, D.C. They also flew, the Navy started flying out of Anacostia. The first development flight program that the Wright brothers were involved in was in College Park, Maryland. Then about World War I time, they decided, the Army Air Corps, Signal Corps, decided to centralize their development work at McCook Field in Dayton, Ohio, Huffman Prairie. McCook Field lasted for about 10 years, and during World War I, military test flying was there weren't really a lot of U.S. airplanes developed. In World War I, U.S. pilots actually flew a lot of French airplanes, not U.S. planes. Little story about Jimmy Doolittle. Jimmy Doolittle was besides being very well known for the Doolittle Raiders in April of '42, our first attack back on Japan in retaliation to Pearl Harbor. Much earlier than that, Jimmy Doolittle started flying about the time of World War I. He did not fly in combat, but in 1924, he did some flight testing at McCook Field on G-loadings. He was doing G-accelerations on pilots and on airplanes, structural stuff. He actually broke the airplane. But MIT gave him his master's degree, and Jimmy Doolittle got the first PhD in aerospace sciences in 1925. But Jimmy Doolittle was a very well-known proponent in those days of systematizing and formalizing the training for test pilots. That's a picture of McCook Field near Dayton, Ohio, near the river. And then they moved from McCook Field to Wright Field, which still exists today. It's the home of the Air Force Museum at Wright Field. And actually, I didn't fly as, I think it was, I don't know if it was Frank Toole or somebody said that I got my license from Orville Wright. That wasn't really true, but I did start flying at Wright Field, but not until the late 1960s. Flew at Wright Field and also at Patterson Field. But Wright Field was the head of flight test and flight test development from about 1927 until the jet age, when they finally had to start moving out and moving to bigger pieces of real estate, and eventually moved to Muroc Dry Lake, which later became Edwards Air Force Base, north of here in California. I'll talk a little bit about that some more. Also at Wright Field, during World War II, most of the enemy airplanes that we achieved, either by somebody stealing them or taking them after the war, were brought to Wright Field for testing and exploitation. The Germans had a lot of technology. Remember, the first jet airplane was the Me-262, and the Me-262 was brought to Wright Field for testing. And I'm quite sure, I know Bob Hoover flew it, but I think maybe also Chuck Yeager flew it at Wright Field, the Me-262. At Wright Field, there was a gentleman by the name of Colonel Al Boyd. He was considered the father of modern flight test. And test pilots he had, like Yeager, Hoover, Bob Cardenas. Bob Cardenas used to be here at the museum quite a bit. Bob passed away a couple of years ago down in San Diego. But he's the guy who did the hard work for Yeager. He's the guy who flew the B-29 that hauled Yeager into the air in 1947 when he first broke the speed of sound. During World War II, the Germans had a lot of different pilots flying, including one very famous female test pilot, Hanna Reich, who I had the honor of meeting one time at the Society of Experimental Test Pilot Convention in Beverly Hills. At the Beverly Hilton Hotel, she came over and the society made her an honorary fellow in our organization. She started out as a glider pilot and tested all sorts of airplanes, a rocket-powered Me-163, and believe it or not, a piloted version of the V-1 buzz bomb. sitting in front of, see if I can show you the picture of that thing. Yeah, I guess that's it right there. That little guy right there. And she was only one of 7 test pilots to survive. Most of the people were killed trying to test that airplane. It was an idea that was dropped later on. They called it Hermann Goering called it a suicide mission to try to fly that thing. But some of the designers wanted to do it. Women in aviation, by the way, this brings me to the point of females in aviation today. They comprise about 10% of the pilots. The Edwards Air Force Base Test Pilot School is currently commanded by a female, Colonel Sabrina Pabon. She was here at the gala this year right here in this hangar, as a matter of fact. She's a flight test engineer, not a pilot, but she commands the Test Pilot School. The commander of the Navy Atlantic Test Wing, which controls Pax River and other test locations, is Liz Somerville. She's a Navy captain, called the Commodore of the Test Wing, and another female. Fred Bell, our director of the museum, is today off up at Lemoore on a change of command where Dragon, another female, took over the squadron up there at Lemoore. She was also a Navy test pilot. So a lot of females have come along a long way in military aviation. Statistics, the Test Pilot School has graduated about 3,300 graduates from the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School, and only 87 of them were females. More coming as we move along. They're becoming, today, when we had open cockpit on the F-104, there was a young gal, a high school, just graduated from high school, a young gal who's starting in the Air Force Academy. She was joyfully jumping in this F-104 because she's looking forward to going to the Air Force Academy and becoming an F-35 pilot. So women have come a long way and still moving along. Wright Field today, Wright-Patterson, it was 2 fields, Wright Field and then Patterson Field was a little bit longer stretch. Actually, my office, my desk, if you will, was over here at Patterson Field. And we had fighter tests, cargo tests, and bomber tests there at Wright-Patterson. Today, Wright Field, which in the days when I was flying there in the 60s, this was not there, but this is the U.S. Air Force Flight Museum. Fantastic museum. Fred Bell says it's almost as good as the Palm Springs Air Museum. So, flight testing moved then, as we moved into the jet age, moved from Wright-Patterson to Edwards Air Force Base. Why? Well, primarily because of this little beauty out here, Rogers Dry Lake. There's the runway. There's the 15,000-foot runway. And this, if I can draw the line properly, is a 7.5-mile-long runway that was used for the space shuttle and a lot of lifting body work, saved millions and millions of dollars in airplanes. I'll tell you a story about my experience with the A-7 where I had to land on that lake bed. Edwards initially was called Muroc Air Base. By the way, trivia, Muroc is Coram spelled backwards. The Coram family owned a piece of real estate up there, and when the military came in, they took it over. And they just changed the name to Muroc from Coram. Why, I don't know. But the NASA test facility is there, Dryden Test Facility, which a lot of development work still going on today. The Test Pilot School exists at Edwards Air Force Base. Happy Bottom Riding Club. Who's heard of the Happy Bottom Riding Club before? I know about probably about 5 or 6 of you. Happy Bottom Riding Club was a bar, restaurant, but it was not, as a lot of people say, a brothel. It was run by a female aviator by the name of Pancho Barnes, a very well-skilled pilot of the 30s and 40s. Pancho did a lot more exotic flying and a lot more interesting flying than even Jackie Cochran. Pancho, I met her up at Edwards. She was still around when I was there in the Aerospace Research Pilot School in 67 and 68. But she ran the Happy Bottom Riding Club, and it was a place to hang out. If you remember the movie The Right Stuff, where Chuck Yeager goes into the Happy Bottom Riding Club and gets a drink from the bartender. By the way, in that movie, The Right Stuff, the bartender that Chuck Yeager, who played Chuck Yeager in that movie? Sam Shepard? Anybody know? I think it was. Anyway, Chuck Yeager, the Hollywood version of Chuck Yeager, walks in to order a drink from the bartender behind the bar, and the bartender is Chuck Yeager himself. He got a bit part in the movie, and he was the bartender. The lake bed was used for all sorts of things. The X-15, the space shuttle, the SR-71, today's day, the F-35, and soon to be the B-21 coming along. So the earliest time that I can find, the field was used as a bombing range during World War II. But in 1935, Wiley Post took off from LA in the Winnie Mae and had an engine failure at some altitude and dead sticked his Winnie Mae on Rogers Dry Lake. Interesting little trivia. In October of 1942, the XP-59 was the first jet airplane the Army Air Corps had, was flown by Bob Stanley at Edwards, or at Muroc Dry Lake. Again, 7.5 miles long and quite a piece of real estate. All sorts of airplanes at Edwards. This one's kind of interesting. I'll talk a little bit more about that. That's a rocket version of this F-104. It sits in front of the test pilot school at Edwards Air Force Base on a pylon. That's the airplane I flew in 1968, the only one that was left. Chuck Yeager jumped out of one. I'll tell you a little bit more about that story. They're built 3. Chuck jumped out of one. There were 2 left. One guy had the rocket blow up in the back. He got the airplane down. There was 1 left, and I got to fly it back in June of 1968. Our F-117 development was done at Edwards. Of course, all the other airplanes, the X-1, the space shuttle development was done there. There was a rocket test flight facility where they tested off rockets. The Flying Wing, the B-2 that was developed by Northrop Corporation, flew there. Earlier versions of the Flying Wing, designed by Jack Northrop, flew out of Edwards as well. And of course, Pancho Barnes and her Happy Bottom Riding Club. Really the home of aerospace development. In October 1947, Chuck Yeager, we all know that story. Chuck Yeager, first man to break the speed of sound in October of 1947. He was taken aloft by Bob Cardenas in the B-29, chased by Bob Hoover in a T-33, and Jack Ridley, who was his, if you remember the movie, The Right Stuff, he's the guy that gave him the piece of stick because he broke his ribs. That's a true story, by the way. Chuck Yeager, the night before he went out to break the speed of sound, was at the Happy Bottom Riding Club for a party. Went out on a horse ride with his wife, glamorous Glennis, his wife's name was Glennis. They went out for a horse ride, and they were riding from the Happy Bottom Riding Club back to where he lived on the base, and they ran into a fence. He didn't stop quick enough, and he got thrown off the horse, broke a couple of ribs, and then went off and flew the X-1 the next day and broke the speed of sound with a couple of broken ribs. By the way, you may or may not know this, but there was another test pilot, a North American test pilot by the name of George Welch, who a couple of weeks before Chuck broke the speed of sound actually went supersonic in XP-86, the F-86, the X version of the F-86, and broke the speed of sound before Chuck did. Wasn't authorized, so it was kind of swept under the rug until Chuck then got to fly it in 1947. There's another story, and I'm not exactly sure if this one's accurate, but that Jack Woodman, the Bell test pilot, who flew earlier tests on the X-1, wanted $100,000 to go and break the speed of sound in this X-1, and I think it was Al Boyd. I'm not sure. The general who was in charge said, $100,000? No way. He says, I got a captain over here who'll do it for $400, and they picked Yeager to go fly it. The X-planes flew at Edwards. All the X-planes. These are various ones. That one in the middle is kind of interesting. You remember the X-3? That thing was supposed to go very, very fast and very, very high. It had a lot of problems with the engine, so it never really did anything more than just barely go supersonic. These planes were flown by pilots like Pete Everest. Ivan Kinchelow was killed in an F-104. Mel App was killed in a rocket airplane. Joe Walker, another test pilot, very famous test pilot, involved in the XB-70 program. But you remember can't remember the exact year, but the XB-70, F-104, T-38, a bunch of other airplanes were up flying doing their test missions. They all joined up for a publicity photo to be taken by a Learjet flown by Clay Lacy, our famous Clay Lacy, who's contributed his Lear. It might have been that Lear that's back behind us right here. It was up trying to take a picture of that formation, and Joe Walker got in trouble, got into the wingtip vortice of the XB-70, rolled over into it, and 3 people were killed in that, and of course it lost the X-70. It was a very tragic accident. But Marion Carroll was a Marine test pilot who was the first Marine test pilot, I think, to go more than twice the speed of sound. So a lot of testing at Edwards Air Force Base. The X-15 came on a little bit later in the 1960s, first flown by Scott Crossfield, who was a North American test pilot, and then Pete Knight, a friend of mine, still today holds the speed record for a winged airplane, more than Mach 6 at 100,000 feet. He was pushing the airplane with all the rocket power he could get. It was dropped from a B-52 and flew that airplane to Mach 6. Bob White, another former boss of mine, I didn't know him extremely well, he wasn't my friend, but Bob flew the X-15 up to over 300,000 feet in July of '72. So the X-15, again, always landed on the lake bed at Edwards, had skids, had a nose gear, but as main gear were skids. I like that little cartoon, it's kind of cute. In our own Bob Gilliland, who lived here in Palm Desert, was the first pilot to fly the SR-71, the famous Blackbird. Mach 3 plus airplane, still holds the records for non-rocket equipped aircraft of fastest speeds, holds the records from New York to London. Another friend of mine who flew F-100s with me, Jim Sullivan, flew from New York to London in 1 hour and 54 minutes. That's a hell of a lot faster than, obviously, than the Concorde. Of course, the SR-71, other variants that flew were the YF-12, the A-12. Is a CIA airplane. And the SR-71 was retired, I can't remember the year, but it was a great airplane, high technology, special fuel, was a fantastic advancement in aerospace technology. Spaceflight came along a little bit later on. In the 60s, we had the Mercury and Gemini programs, and then, of course, Apollo in 1969. You remember Apollo 1 in early development before the Aldrin and Armstrong and Collins went to the moon. In January of '67, Gus Grissom and Ed White and Roger Chaffee were killed in the fire on the test bed and the launching pad down in Florida. Tragic accident. Of course, shuttle developments at Edwards, where the shuttle first flew captive on top of a 747 and then was finally released for glide flights and then for powered flights. All that work was done at Edwards Air Force Base, where they landed the airplane on the lake bed. Get on to a little bit more specifically about some of the stuff that I did. The Aerospace Research Pilot School was a sort of a coming of space age version of the test pilot school. A lot of minimum requirements. You had to have a science degree, you had to have a lot of flying time. They called it the MIT Caltech of military aviation. It was a 1-year program. 6 months of test pilot training, which was basically precision flying, and 6 months of what I called astronaut prep school. So I went through the test pilot school in 1967 for 1 year, graduated in '68. So what do you do after you graduate from a test pilot school? whether it be the Aerospace Research Pilot School version of it, into a space program, or into regular test flying. All sorts of jobs, from nothing, mundane kind of stuff, to disastrous kind of things. You could do all sorts of tests. An important part of test flying was chasing other airplanes. Bob Hoover chased Chuck Yeager on his first supersonic flight, for instance. We did performance, stability control, spin testing, high altitude testing, how fast does it go, how long can it go, and ultimately you're basically developing the flight manuals that were used by operational pilots. So one of the jobs that I got was to test the first A-7D that the Air Force received in late 1969. I wanted to go into the MOLE program, the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program that NASA had, but unfortunately it was canceled for budget reasons. I think the space shuttle designs were starting to come along, so they decided to cancel the MOLE program. So I didn't have any opportunity at that time for a good program to go into NASA. So I went on to become a jock, just a regular old test pilot, and I went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Let's talk a little bit about the SLUF now. The A-7D Corsair II. People say, why is it called the SLUF, the short, little, ugly fellow? That airplane, look at it. It is a kind of a squat little airplane. A squat-looking little airplane, basically, it was designed by LTV, by Vought Aircraft, and it was the basic design of the airplane was sort of a scaled-down F-8. Remember the F-8 Crusader, great fighter airplane. The A-7 was a downsize from that. Little short airplane, funny little intake on the front, and they called it the SLUF, the nickname the pilots gave it. But the A-7D that the Air Force got was very different than this A-7A, which we have here at the museum. A-7A first flew in '64. The A-7D flew later. And it had a TF-41 upgraded engine. It had a 20-millimeter Gatling gun instead of two regular 20-millimeter guns. It also had a new avionics package. First airplane had a heads-up display in that the Air Force developed, and an automatic weapons delivery system. It was a very nice upgrade from that airplane. So I did all-weather testing. I did it at various places. I first flew the airplane down to Florida, and then I did cold weather testing up in Alaska, hot weather testing, and then wet down in Panama, hot weather here at El Centro, obviously. It was a little bit, El Centro had a base. We probably would have flown it here at the Palm Springs Air Museum if it existed at that time. I also did the icing tests up at Edwards. That's a fun little story. I'll tell you that in a second. And I also did a lot of the initial in-flight refueling tests. The Air Force converted this airplane from a probe and drogue refueling airplane to a boom refueling. So I was involved in the development of the boom refueling for this airplane. Climatic hangar at Edwards, that picture isn't very good, but that shows my little airplane down here under the wing almost of a C-5. And that hangar at Eglin, I took off from Navy Dallas, flew it down to Eglin, stuck it there for 3 months while they did everything they could do to it in a hangar. Up in Alaska, again with my friend, the C-5. The C-5 was an interesting airplane. It was doing the cold weather testing the same time I was doing the cold weather testing on the A-7. That airplane was flown by Pete Audrews, who was later commander of the Flight Test Center at Edwards. And Pete, when he would take off, he'd push those engines up, he'd knock the field down to 0-0. It had so much condensation coming out of the engines, it would shut the airport down in ice fog. So I made a deal with Pete. I'll take off, fly 2 or 3 hours, and you can have the field to yourself. And so I was able to do it. The coldest takeoff I had was 58 below zero. We left the airplane out all the time. It wasn't hangared. Purpose of it was to cold soak it, see if the systems would still work. And that's basically what I was doing. That's a picture of me in my funny little outfit. You can see I had boots and parkas, a couple sets of gloves. Take off the gloves inside the airplane because I had inertial nav and I had other things I had to do with my fingers. I couldn't do them with those big mittens on, so I'd take them off, and I had silk gloves underneath it so I could operate the systems inside the airplane. The test Edwards, or at Fairbanks, needed a team. There's 25 people there that supported me. Everything from crew chiefs, tech reps, engineers, armament, simulators, all the testing, everything in flight testing needs a team building up to it, from initial design all the way through its entire development. At El Centro, just see how hot you can keep an airplane outside and then go fly and see if things would work. Down at Howard, rain, rain, rain. I was drenched when I got into the airplane and did testing, but all of the systems worked. I dropped bombs and shotguns. I couldn't throw the bombs off the bullseye on the target with this weapon system that we had in this airplane. It was a fantastic machine. Quick story about Edwards. That's me, and I don't know if you can see it, but I look like a yellow popsicle. I was flying behind a KC-135 with a spray nozzle on it. It was spraying yellow water at me, no pun intended. It was spraying yellow water, and it soaked the airplane, and ice built up all over the airplane. The airplane did not have icing boots. It had a pitot-static, it had a pitot heat, but that was about it. And so the windshield got iced up, the radome on the front of the nose got iced up, and the intake. On the last test point, all that stuff came off, went down into the engine, hit the turbofan in front of the compressor, dinged all the fan blades. Sounded like the engine was coming apart on me, really loud noises. And I thought it was going to blow up. I thought I'd have to get out of the airplane. So I'm flying over Rogers Dry Lake at Edwards. So what did I do? I did the smart thing. I shut the engine down and became a glider. So the only dead stick flight I've ever had in my life was I put that thing down on the lake bed without a motor running. It was easy, and that's the reason we tested at Edwards Air Force Base. Just a sort of another day in the life of a test pilot. So the SLUF could go anywhere, deliver ordnance, outstanding accuracy in all conditions. The airplane was almost too easy to fly. It was, after flying, coming from things like the F-100, this airplane was super easy to fly and a very great weapons delivery system. In Vietnam, it flew a lot of sorties, not many losses, delivered more ordnance over Hanoi than any other airplane in the war other than the B-52. I didn't know that, but that even beat out Frank Tullow's F-105 for dropping ordnance on Hanoi. But anyway, it could carry a lot and it could drop it very accurately. It flew primarily late in the Vietnam War in Linebacker 2 in December of '72. The Navy was impressed with the Air Force's A-7D, so they adopted it also. They liked the TF-41 engine, they did a couple other things, and their further production on the A-7 became the A-7E, which was a growth partner of the A-7D. 460, 459 delivered to the Air Force. Production ended in '76. It went to the Guard and other organizations. It also, let me back that up just a second. It also then was a test airplane for the 117 program. When the 117 was flying and being hidden up at Tonopah Test Range, the 117 pilots were flying this airplane for training for the 117 program. I'm going to shift gears now and switch off to my little flight that I flew in this airplane, the F-104, that had a rocket in the tail. You remember the movie The Right Stuff? Chuck Yeager jumps out of a rocket airplane trying to set a world altitude record at 100,000 feet. He got it into a spin, couldn't get it out, had to jump out. There were two left. One, as I said earlier, one guy had a rocket blow up and tail. There were one left, and I got to fly that one. In June of 1968, I flew it to 101,830 feet. Pretty simple little flight. Take off, go like a bat out of hell, get going at Mach about 2.25 at 35,000 feet, light the rocket, pull up, fly up, shut the afterburner down at about 70,000 feet, shut the jet engine down at 80, ride the rocket till it burns out, then you're a glider, you're a bullet. Peek up over the top using reaction control jets, up over the top at 101,000 feet, looking. I was going like from Santa Barbara, or from Barstow to Santa Barbara. I could see up to Monterey and down to Baja, black to blue in the sky, semi-edge of space, not really, but flying 0G for a couple of minutes while I'm pushing this thing over with reaction control jets. Get back down to 40 or 35,000 feet, relit the jet, and landed. If it didn't start, I could land on a lake bed. That's why we peaked out, and the mission profile was to peak out over the dry lake bed. Fun flight. That's me in my little space suit with my portable air conditioner. Who's that good-looking guy there? And believe me, that was 1968. I can't remember how many years ago. It was a long time. That airplane, the airplane I flew now sits on a pole up at Edwards. I also ran the F-5 E&F test program, a great airplane, one of the most favorite fighters I ever flew. I tested that, got in the program in 1970, didn't leave till 1975, so a 4 or 5 year development program. We first flew it in 1972. We flew some prototypes before that. But that airplane, if you remember the first Maverick movie, that airplane is also the MiG-28 that Tom Cruise shot down in the first Top Gun movie. Flown primarily by lots of countries, still being flown by the Navy at Fallon as an aggressor airplane, and being flown by some private aggressor outfits flying against airplane. It's a super, can't be seen, it's a little tiny airplane, doesn't smoke, it's a great little machine. Quickly on, my last flying job was flying the Warthog. And I keep wearing that A-10 hat, but that's a great airplane. Still flying, the Air Force is trying to retire it. You may have seen the Wall Street Journal article yesterday where it says, why are we still flying the A-10? Because it's the only thing that can do the real good close air support job with a 30 millimeter gun and 1,200 rounds. I'm going to show you, I got time, I'm going to show you a little bit about that airplane. So this is kind of what I did for a living, and I hope, Greg, if you're here, I hope this sound works. Sound? Where's Greg? Okay, I'm going to back it up. You give me some sound on the video? Ready? If it doesn't give you this, nope, it's not there. That's okay. The sound is just good music. But this is the airplane doing its job. That gun is always shooting the gun, and it's hitting targets on the ground. Okay, we don't have the sound. But the airplane was a very, very capable close air support weapon system. It's a pretty short video, but that's what it does with the 30 millimeter shells. I didn't fly it in combat. I had the first operational squadron in 1978. This is mostly from Desert Storm and also from some of the development testing. Watch it, get those tanks. Anyway, that's what the A-10 did, excuse me. That's good, Greg. My last job, I ended up in the White House. I get dragged up to the Pentagon in 1979 from my A-10 job. I wound up working for Reagan for a couple of years in the White House on the National Security Council. It was really fun. Your problem with that is that you always end up in a desk job, but this was, I called it from the Warthog to the White House. It was a lot of fun. As I said, we're talking about flight testing then. This is now. What do you got? Fly-by-wire, computer-aided flight controls, drones, hypersonic missiles, combat collaborative aircraft. That's a drone wingman. You're flying your fighter and you got 5 or 6 drones flying autonomously on your wing. Things are going crazy. AI. Ad inexplorata is a test pilot's motto. It means toward the unknown. And where is it going? Who knows? I mean, things are moving along. I'm talking a half a century ago, the testing I did. Today's day is mostly all digital and a heck of a lot of new technology. So with that, I'd like to, about 10 minutes, I'd like to see if anybody's got any questions.